cop stopped the wrong bike. Minutes later, 50 soldiers in Humvees arrived, led by a captain. "Is this your idea of a joyride, sir?" The young officer's voice sliced through the morning air, sharp, uninviting. The man in front of her didn't move. His posture was still, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel of a battered electric roadster that looked like it belonged in a museum, not on an active street in Malden. His eyes, pale and steady, didn't flinch. He didn't need to, because in less than 15 minutes, 4 black SUVs bearing Royal Navy insignias would roll into town, and an entire patrol unit would find out exactly who they'd just stopped. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where true stories and inspired tales meet at the intersection of silence, strength, and second chances. If you believe respect is earned not with words, but with time and sacrifice, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe now and ring the bell so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world around you. Now, back to Malden, a quiet English town better known for cobbled lanes and wind-whipped coastlines than for confrontations. And yet, there stood Alexander Gray, 85 years old, a retired Royal Navy commander, and a man who still believed in tightening his own bolts and polishing his own boots. That morning, as he rode into town to buy a replacement spark converter for his roadster, he expected a short errand and a cup of black tea afterward. Not flashing lights, not judgment, and certainly not having to prove that the decades he had lived meant more than just numbers on a license. The officer, PC Emily Clark, 31, only had a few years in uniform, but they'd hardened her sense of vigilance. She had protocols to follow, and a rusty electric vehicle cruising under the speed limit seemed as suspicious as anything else out of place. She didn't know Alexander, didn't know about the medals tucked away in a drawer he never opened, didn't know that every morning since his wife passed, he'd gotten up at 5:30 to maintain that car, not for vanity, but because it reminded him of the journeys they once took together. What she saw was just an old man behind the wheel of a machine that looked like it might fall apart before it reached the next corner. "License and registration, please," she said again, this time firmer. Gray's hands moved slowly, not from hesitation, but precision, as he reached for his documents. He knew the script well. He'd lived long enough to recognize the pattern of eyes that saw age before capability. He handed over the papers without a word, letting the silence do the talking. Clark glanced at the birth year. 1939. Her brow lifted slightly. She said nothing, but the question hung in the air between them like fog. Should someone his age even be on the road? What she didn't realize, not yet, was that this wasn't just about a car, or age, or traffic safety. This was about something deeper, something the uniform couldn't teach her. But she was about to learn. She looked at him like he was a cracked statue, something outdated that didn't belong out here in motion. But Alexander Gray had stood under artillery fire at sea. He had given orders during sandstorm blackouts in Basra. He had pulled his best friend's body out of saltwater wreckage and folded his uniform for his mother without shaking. A street interrogation from an officer half his age didn't come close to rattling him. But what did sting, quietly, invisibly, was knowing he'd been reduced to a checklist. A potential problem, an age on a license. Emma Clark tightened her grip on her belt. She wasn't being disrespectful, at least not on purpose. She was doing what training told her. Look for instability, erratic behavior, signs of confusion. And to be fair, standing perfectly still, not answering, just staring, that fit the criteria. "Sir, are you feeling all right today?" she asked, firmer now, a trace of concern hiding behind authority. Alexander didn't reply. His eyes remained fixed, not on her, but on something behind her, something she couldn't see. That wasn't rudeness. That was calculation. He was measuring her, weighing what kind of officer she was, whether she deserved words. The truth was, silence had saved him more times than speech ever had. On a covert mission in the Baltic, it was silence that let him pass as a dock worker while intelligence was smuggled out in fishing crates. Silence that helped him endure 7 days of captivity when they broke 3 of his ribs, but not his will. And silence now, because words would only give her more to misinterpret. He wasn't going to argue with someone who hadn't lived long enough to know what regret feels like in your joints. She leaned in slightly. "Mr. Gray, I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle." He turned his head slowly, the kind of movement that used to signal entire decks to attention. There was no hostility in his expression, just weight. Clark felt it, but couldn't name it. She stepped back, uneasily. Across the street, phones were already pointed toward them. A group of teens, a middle-aged woman on a power walk, even someone from the bakery doorway. It didn't take much these days, just the sight of a cop talking to an old man like he might be trouble. Alexander heard the murmurs ripple. Poor guy probably doesn't even know what day it is. He looks lost. What's she hassling him for? Everyone had a theory. No one had facts. They didn't know that Alexander Gray had once helped decode enemy transmissions that prevented a NATO blockade. That he'd spent 20 years training naval officers in Singapore and Norway. That he hadn't missed a single inspection check for his vehicle since the day he bought it secondhand and rebuilt it bolt by bolt with his own hands. What they saw was just an old man not answering fast enough. "Sir, I need verbal confirmation that you're not under duress or suffering from any mental confusion." Her voice had gone full procedural now. There was no curiosity left, just boxes to tick. And that, perhaps more than anything, was what pushed something loose in Alexander's chest. Not anger, not fear, just recognition. He had become invisible in a world he once helped protect. The officer didn't know his name. The people filming didn't care what he'd done. And the silence that had always been his armor suddenly started to feel like isolation. He inhaled deeply, preparing to speak, not because he needed to, but because maybe she did. "I'm fine," he said finally, voice low but clear. "And I know exactly where I am." His words didn't raise his voice, but they dropped to silence over the growing crowd. Officer Clark straightened, surprised not by the words themselves, but by the way they landed, deliberate, grounded, like they came from someone who had nothing left to prove. "Then step out of the vehicle, sir." Her tone shifted again, a little sharper now, because deep down she could feel control slipping. And Emma Clark hated losing control. Alexander unbuckled his seatbelt with the same efficiency he once used to secure lifelines in a storm. He stepped out slowly, posture upright, gaze steady. There was no limp, no stumble, no sign of confusion. Just a man who didn't rush unless it mattered. And right now it didn't. A teenage boy across the street raised his phone higher and muttered, "This is going to go viral." Someone else said, "He looks like he doesn't even know what's happening." Another, "Maybe he's dangerous." Why else would she be so on edge? That's how it always starts. No one asks questions. They just fill in the blanks with fear. Officer Clark moved closer, placing herself squarely in front of him. "Sir, what is your purpose for driving today?" "Picking up a part," he answered. "A converter module. For the car." He said it plainly, without defensiveness. She blinked. It caught her off guard. She'd expected hesitation, confusion, maybe deflection. Instead, he was giving her facts, straight and calm. But it wasn't enough. "Are you under medication that might impair your judgment? Have you been evaluated recently?" He met her eyes for the first time. "You're not asking these questions because you care about my health. You're asking because you think I don't belong here." And just like that, the line had been drawn. Clark opened her mouth to respond, but she hesitated. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Somewhere between protocol and paranoia, she'd stopped treating him like a citizen and started treating him like a liability. Her body language shifted ever so slightly, defensive now, not just official. She turned to her radio, speaking quietly into the mic clipped to her shoulder. "Unit 12 requesting backup. Possible psychological evaluation required. Male subject, elderly, uncooperative." Across the street, someone heard the phrase psychological evaluation and whispered it to another. Within seconds, it spread like wildfire. "They think he's senile. They're going to take him in." What for? Who knows? He's just standing there. Inside the small electronics shop 2 blocks down, a man named Lewis Harding looked up from the counter. He'd been a signalman on HMS Trafalgar back in the 80s. Recognized Gray the moment he saw that familiar, rigid stance. He'd once been briefed by Commander Alexander Gray before a covert NATO drill, back when they still called him sir before every sentence. Lewis put down the part he was holding, walked to the back of the store, and picked up the landline. His hands were steady. He didn't call emergency services. He called someone else. Outside, the tension thickened. Clark stood stiffly now, waiting for her requested support. Alexander stood motionless, arms behind his back. She had moved into enforcement mode, he into endurance. The difference was only one of them knew what was about to happen next. From across the street, Marcus Hughes narrowed his eyes as he watched the interaction unfolding in front of the bakery. He hadn't seen that posture in decades, but he knew it instantly. Shoulders squared, back straight, not stiff but trained, the kind of stance that didn't come from old age, but from years of commanding respect under fire. That wasn't just an old man. That was Alexander Gray, Commander Gray. Marcus had been 21, seasick and scared on a Royal Navy frigate in the North Sea when Gray first barked orders at him. They hadn't spoken in years, but he never forgot. You don't forget the man who taught you how to keep your head when a ship's engine caught fire 300 miles from shore. You don't forget the officer who stayed behind on deck to manually secure a cannon while others scrambled for shelter. And now here he was, being questioned like a trespasser in his own town. Marcus didn't wait. He stepped back inside the garage where he worked, wiped his hands, and reached for the emergency line only used by ex-service contacts. No dramatics. No long explanation. Just a calm, direct sentence. Commander Alexander Gray is being detained in Malden. He's not resisting, but it doesn't look right. There was silence for 2 seconds, then a firm reply. Stay put. Response unit en route. Do not let them move him. Marcus hung up, stepped outside, and folded his arms. He didn't need to raise his voice or get involved. He'd made the only call that mattered. Minutes later, just as backup units were arriving to support Officer Clark, the low hum of diesel engines began to echo from the road that curved into the edge of town. At first, it blended into traffic, but then it grew louder, controlled, purposeful. And then they saw them, 4 matte black Land Rovers, each bearing Royal Navy insignias, moving in tight formation. They didn't stop at intersections. They didn't hesitate at the roundabout. They were coming exactly where they meant to go. The crowd turned. Phones came back out, but this time the tone shifted. What's going on? Is that the military? Who is this guy? Clark squinted, uncertain. She instinctively stepped between Gray and the street, as if shielding the situation from unknown escalation. But Gray didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. He had seen that approach before, during state visits, during escort missions, and once during a last-minute extraction in Kosovo. The first Land Rover stopped directly behind the police unit. Doors opened in sequence, precise, rehearsed. 2 officers stepped out, both in dress uniform. But it was the third who drew everyone's attention. Commander Julian Shaw, Naval Security Liaison, 48 years old, walked with a purpose that suggested he didn't need to speak twice. He approached Gray first. Sir. He offered a crisp salute. Gray returned it without hesitation. We received word. I trust you're unharmed. Gray gave a small nod. Clark stepped forward. Excuse me, who exactly are you? Shaw turned his eyes on her. Commander Julian Shaw, Royal Navy. And you're currently detaining a decorated senior officer without cause or context. Explain. Her mouth opened, but the words got stuck. For a second, she looked down at Gray's paperwork again, rereading the name. It hadn't clicked before. There was no flag next to it. No annotation. Just Alexander Gray. No taites. No ranks. Just another name in a civilian database. Shaw turned to the backup officers now on scene. Is there any legal charge against this man? They shook their heads. Clark's radio crackled, but she ignored it. We were just trying to determine if he was fit to drive. He didn't respond immediately. Shaw repeated, not hiding the disdain. So you assumed mental deficiency, rather than physical awareness, rather than military composure, rather than respect. One of the rovers repositioned slightly to make room. Clark watched it move, then looked back at Gray. She saw him differently now. Not older, not slower, but larger somehow, as if a light had turned on and revealed something that had always been there, but gone unnoticed. The crowd had gone quiet. Phones were still up, But now they weren't capturing a takedown. They were documenting a revelation. Clark took a small step back. Her training didn't prepare her for this. Not the protocol part, not the PR side, and definitely not the human part. She wasn't looking at a suspect anymore. She was standing in front of a man who'd been given more responsibility in a week than she might face in a career. "Sir," she started, voice lower now, stripped of command. "Commander Gray, I didn't know." Alexander looked at her. Not with anger, not even disappointment. Just a look that had weight. A kind of stillness that carried more meaning than a reprimand ever could. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You didn't ask. You assumed." Commander Shaw stepped in again, this time addressing the entire scene. "This man has served this country across 4 continents, survived 2 shipwrecks, commanded special operations in the Gulf and off the coast of Indonesia. He holds the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross and 2 Queen's Commendations for bravery. You question him over a license check and silence. Silence, by the way, is something he learned to master in a job where speaking out of turn could cost lives." His words weren't angry. They were exact, measured, like a knife laid gently on a table with its edge still sharp. Clark took another breath. This time, she didn't hide behind her badge. "Sir, I am sorry. Truly, I let my assumptions speak louder than your silence. I thought I was being careful, but I wasn't being respectful." For the first time, Alexander's expression shifted. Not softened, but realigned. He gave a slight nod. "Respect," he said, "isn't about saluting medals or memorizing service records. It's about seeing people before you judge them." She nodded slowly. "Understood." Shaw turned toward the officers. "This incident is logged. There will be no formal complaint. Commander Gray requested that himself. But we will be issuing a full report to HQ. And we strongly recommend retraining procedures on field engagement, particularly with elderly citizens and veterans." Clark didn't argue. She didn't retreat. She just stood still and took it in. As Shaw saluted one last time and turned to return to the Land Rover, Gray paused. He looked at Clark, then at the crowd, then down at the dusty ground beneath his boots. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "I've had people shoot at me with less hostility than some of the looks I got today." And then he smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. The kind you only gain with age and scars. "But I still believe we can be better." With that, he turned, walked back to his roadster, and climbed in. The ignition hummed. The car, old but well-kept, came to life without a hitch. And as he pulled away, the crowd parted, not just to give him space, but out of something older than policy, respect. 1 week later, the Malden Precinct conference room was filled with uniformed officers sitting straighter than usual, eyes forward, listening to a voice most of them didn't expect to hear. Commander Julian Shaw stood at the front, sleeves rolled, demeanor calm but firm. Behind him, a projector displayed 3 words in bold white letters. Assume nothing. Ask first. It wasn't mandatory, but every officer was there. What happened with Alexander Gray had made its way through the department, not as a scandal, but as a wake-up call. Officer Clark had volunteered to speak first. Her voice was steady as she recounted the mistake, not just in action, but in mindset. "I thought I was protecting the public. But what I really did was forget that the people we serve include those who've already served more than I ever will." Shaw nodded once, said nothing. He didn't need to. The lesson had landed. The partnership between the precinct and the Royal Navy's Veteran Affairs Unit became permanent. Officers would now complete a 1-day field training alongside retired service members, learning not about weapons or tactics, but about patience, memory, and the weight of time. The kind of weight you only understand when you've carried something long enough to forget it's even there. 2 weeks later, Clark found herself driving a quiet stretch of road along the southern river bend. She wasn't on duty. No uniform. Just a woman with a thermos of coffee and a question she hadn't stopped thinking about since that morning in town. Gray's property wasn't listed on any public map, but locals knew it. White brick, clean lines, neat fencing, nothing fancy. She parked, walked slowly toward the shed near the back, where she spotted a familiar old electric roadster parked under the tree. She called out softly, "Commander?" A low voice answered from under the hood. Depends who's asking. She smiled. Someone who owes you a better introduction. Gray emerged, wiping his hands on a rag that looked older than her car. He looked at her for a long second, then gestured toward the porch. Coffee. She held up her own. I brought mine. Fair enough, he said, and sat down. She joined him. There was no lecture. No epaligi. Just space. Real conversation. He asked her why she became a police officer. She told him. Then he asked, how many accidents have you responded to that were actually caused by people my age? She paused, did the math, then frowned. Almost none. Most of them are young guys. Speeding. Drunk. Distracted. He raised an eyebrow. Then why did you assume I was the danger? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any defense. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that isn't awkward, just honest. Clark finally asked, why didn't you tell me who you were that day? Gray took a slow sip from his mug and replied, because it shouldn't matter. Whether I was a commander or just an old man picking up a part, I still deserve to be treated like a human being. That answer stuck with her more than any manual or policy ever had. Because it wasn't about rank or reputation. It was about dignity. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is not assume they need to prove anything to you. From where I'm sitting as the one telling you this story, I want to say this much. Respect isn't something we're born deserving, but it's something we all carry the right to claim. Not because of our jobs, our uniforms, or our medals, but because of the miles we've walked and the stories we hold. I've spent years writing about people like Alexander Gray. And what I've learned is this. Age doesn't make someone invisible. It makes them deeper. Every wrinkle, every scar, every pause before they speak, it's not slowness. It's evidence. Evidence that they've lived more life than most of us can imagine. So if this story made you think, even just a little, take that feeling and do something with it. Next time you see someone older moving slower, don't rush to judgment. Ask before assuming. Listen before deciding. Because sometimes behind that silence is a man who once helped keep an entire fleet afloat during a storm. Or a woman who raised a generation while the world kept spinning around her. If this resonated with you, leave a comment. Tell us your thoughts. Maybe even share a story of someone who deserves more respect than they usually get. Hit the like button if you believe stories like this matter. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remember people. We honor silence. And we listen for the parts that often go unheard. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.